Hello and welcome to FI for Kids, a podcast about guiding your kids on the path to financial independence and extraordinary lives. I'm your host, Dominic DeLaquil. Our guest today is Joe Curry. Joe is the senior financial advisor and owner of Matthews & Associates, a leading financial planning company in Ontario. He's also the host of the Your Retirement Planning Simplified podcast, where he provides straightforward answers to big questions about retirement planning. Welcome, Joe, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here, Dominic.
So I want to start with just a little bit of your background and what you learned about money growing up as a kid. So tell us what you learned from your family, and then from there, how you got into financial planning.
Yeah, sure. So when I think back about money, I always think how there's almost like two ends of the spectrum with spending in my family. So what I mean by that is I feel like things were like really tight in a lot of areas. Like there was no wasted money. There was very little, eating out. If we were gone somewhere, it was always like packed lunches. And so there were no pennies wasted, I guess you could say. But then the flip side of that is though my parents had, no problem spending money on quality things or quality experiences for our family. So, when I think back about money, it's quality over quantity, I guess is probably how I would summarize that.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good lesson, though, I think.
Yeah, I think so for sure. I think it also relates to a lot of maybe some of the other things we'll talk about later when it comes to like prioritizing and how do you figure out how to spend your money, right?
Yeah, sure. Was it something that you talked about much? Did they teach you like nuts and bolts kind of stuff, or that's just kind of how they did things and that's what you picked up on?
Yeah, I think it was more modeling than anything. And like we didn't, it's not like we went without, right? Well, we had lots of toys, all that kind of stuff. But it was, I just remember it was always like a big thing of not wasting money or spending money without thinking it through, I guess, at least.
Yeah. So, and then from there, as you grew up then, what got you interested in financial planning?
Yeah. So my dad is, he's a CFP, certified financial planner as well. He used to do a lot of that. Now he's more group benefits, so a little bit different. But when I was younger, he was doing what I do. And I just remember him coming home from work one day. It was during the dot-com crash, so markets were a little bit all over the place. And he was, I could tell he was, excited or had something he wanted to talk about. So I just asked him what was going on. And he had mentioned that he got a call from one of his elderly widowed clients. And she called just to tell him that he was the reason she could sleep at night. And I thought, you know what, that's pretty cool feeling, I'm sure, to get. So that's what kind of got me interested in this path of financial planning.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So for people who don't remember that or don't know, that was the early 2000s. And that was a big deal on the stock market at the time. A big dot-com bubble burst and lost a lot of value there for a while. So, yeah, exactly. And that always stresses people out. So that is really a cool story that she was like, no, I'm not worried because of the work she'd done with your dad. So yeah, very cool.
Yeah. So obviously inspiring enough that I'm still doing this 25 years later.
Yeah. So you've got a couple of kids, 8 and 6, 2 boys. Is that?
That's right. Lewis and Harry.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to circle back around to them in a little bit. But so the work that you do now tends to be more with people that are closer to retirement. And I know you focus a lot with them on priority. And I guess before we get into how you work with them to prioritize things in their life and how that relates to their money, I'm just curious, when they come to you and they're a little bit closer to retirement, do most people already have quite a bit set aside into investment accounts, or are they kind of coming to the game late and then trying to play catch up?
Yeah, I'd say probably a little bit of both. I mean, most of the people that we ultimately end up working with have done usually a pretty good job, or they've had a windfall, like they sold a business or maybe an inheritance or some kind of, or maybe they had, so for you guys it'd be 401k, but maybe like for us, it could be a defined contribution pension plan or group RSP where, they've been saving all this money, but never really had access to it. Now they're retiring and they need to figure out how do they turn that into a retirement income and not pay too much tax and outlive their money, all that kind of stuff. So yeah. And then the flip side of it is people call in sometimes saying that they want to retire tomorrow and they haven't even thought about any of this. And they still have debt, they have nothing saved. And so that's obviously a different conversation. So we get a little bit of all of it. I mean, like the common denominator is people are usually calling us because they want to get things figured out so they can retire soon. But they come in, all different, with all different amounts of assets or preparedness. We've seen it all.
Yeah, yeah. So then let's talk about your approach, because I know you talk about true wealth, which is the idea that, having enough wealth and having financial independence and being able to not have to work is more than just about the financial piece. So I know there's a priority piece that you work with your clients on. So let's talk about that for a little bit.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of people think, and in a lot of cases, they would be right. But a lot of people think that, I'm going to see a financial planner because I need my investments managed. But, the way that we look at it, you mentioned true wealth. So we have our true wealth roadmap, which is really money is more of an ends to a means, right? Like at the end of the, or means to an end. Am I saying that backwards? But anyway,
Yeah, right.
you know what I mean? So really what we're trying to do is help people figure out how they live their best life. How do they, live the retirement that they've been dreaming of? So that money is what's going to help them achieve that in a lot of cases. But it's not really all about, did I get a 6 or 7% rate of return last year, right? And so what we want to do with clients and like with my kids or whatever is we want to take a step back and figure out, what are we solving for? What is most important? And it's easy to kind of go through life without really taking a lot of time to reflect on our values and what's most important. I mean, right now, as you mentioned, my 2 young kids, they're busy in sports. We get school. I've got this business. My wife's a nurse. I mean, we're busy, and it's not always easy to take time to think about this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah,
So,
right.
but at the end of the day, we probably don't want to go through life and look back and think, about the regrets or what we always said we were going to do, but we never did. So what we really try to think about with our clients, and again, like individually, my family, is what is most important to us. And that starts with understanding our values, but then figuring out, especially because we all have limited resources typically. So like, what are those key priorities in our life? And so we usually talk about having like 3 priorities. If we have more than 3 priorities, then we don't have any priorities. And I stole that from who was it? Benjamin Hardy. Dr. Benjamin Hardy is where I got that from. So anyway, yeah. So if we have more than 3 priorities, then we have none, because we're, again, trying to do 2 things or have our hands in too many different areas. For me, it is, my family, number 1, my health, and then my business. So my health is the one that maybe a little, I mean, it's still pretty obvious, but maybe less obvious. For me, that's like staying active, being outdoors, all that kind of stuff is health related, right? And then my family, obviously, it's making sure they're taken care of, making sure I'm not missing out on those years when my boys are young, right? That kind of stuff. And then my business is, at the end of the day, that money piece that keeps it all going. And I enjoy what I do, and I love taking care of people. So it's making sure that that's all taken care of. So those are my 3 priorities. Sometimes there's times for things outside of that, but if it ever comes down to, big ticket expenses, really, we can bring it back to our priorities. Like, is this going through that? You mentioned earlier offline about the filtering process, right? So if I'm filtering these types of like how we're spending our money, is it going back to taking care of those priorities, right? And it's not to say that you're never going to spend money on anything outside of those priorities. Especially if we're noticing we're spending more money, like we can't figure out where our money's going, then it's important to go through a process like that to bring it back to, okay, like, are we spending money on these areas, and are we spending money outside of these areas on things that may be nice, but we don't really need? And it comes back to money. It also comes back to like how we're spending our time too.
Yeah, well, to me, it all fits together, right? And I talk about that a lot. But so it's interesting, right? So I talk about it a lot in the context of parents sort of helping their kids understand that relationship between the money and knowing what they value. It's like you said, we've all got limited resources. Well, most of us, everybody that I've ever known has limited resources, right? So you got to make choices. And if you want to move towards financial independence and make sure you're set up for later in your life or whatever age you get when you can reach financial independence, you've got to then make choices about where you're spending that money, which is what you're talking about. And so, but it's interesting that you're having those conversations with people that are older and closer to traditional retirement versus trying to talk to people that are younger to think about that at an earlier age. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. I just find it interesting that, it's because I think it's actually always relative, right? Because it's also not a fixed thing. Those priorities for you, at some point, those might shift and change a little bit, right? When your boys are old enough and they're growing out of the house, you're still going to care about them and you'll still spend money on them in different ways, but that they may be less of a priority because now they're doing their adult life. And so then you will likely replace that with something else, right? So
Yeah, we talk a lot about that because for a lot of people, their career is one of their priorities. And so when they're approaching retirement, it's like, how are we filling that gap? And a lot of people, whether it's your kids when they're younger and your identity as a parent or your identity as a business owner or your identity as a lawyer, whatever it is, we get really tied up in these identities. So when the kids move out or we retire, like that's a piece of us missing, right? So
Yeah.
it's important to do that like self-reflection and think about, how are those priorities evolving and how do we, continue to have priority and purpose in our life as well.
So how do your clients, how do they take to that part of the conversation when you're having that with them? Are there people that are just a little bit uncomfortable going there or resistant, or do they mostly sort of understand it and then they're happy to think about it and kind of dive in and explore it? How's that go?
Yeah, so the way that we tackle that right now is we actually, ahead of our more in-depth discovery meeting, we send out a worksheet. And sometimes we do it after. Either way, we'll have the conversation, but we send out a worksheet. If it's a couple, we make sure they both do it, and then they can combine to some family values. But at the end of the day, what we're doing is having them narrow down their core values to less than 7 core values. And then so what typically happens is, especially if it's a couple, they'll then talk about these things and then they'll come to the office and then we'll ask them about it and start to have a conversation about it. And usually it's like, yeah, we've never really talked about this. We kind of like know, but also there's some surprises there, things that we didn't actually realize. We made assumptions about our spouse that weren't right all these years. And anyway, it just really, even taking us out of the picture, it seems to really open the dialogue between the couple. Not everyone is open to it. Like some people are just very like, let's just talk about the numbers. But,
Yeah, sure.
most of the people that go through the process, it does really open up these conversations. So they start having more meaningful conversations about what the next chapter is going to look like.
Yeah. Well, I imagine that's pretty cool, right? Because if they're getting closer to retirement, they're already starting to think, okay, what are the things we want to do that maybe we haven't been able to do or something we always wanted to do, bucket list kind of things. And if part of that process working with you is starting to think about those things, I would think that would be kind of exciting for them. And then also like, okay, well, having to make choices and then prioritizing, well, what's most important to us, or what's more important now we want to make sure we do when we still can, versus maybe we'll do some other things later. And I don't know if we'll spend much time on this or not, but maybe later. It'll come back up. So I'll save that, because just this idea of you do different things. Some things are sort of best fit at different points in your life. And I think that's an important consideration for financial independence and retirement and all that sort of stuff. So, so what kind of things do you see? You talked about your priorities. What kind of things do you see from clients? Do you have any interesting examples there?
Yeah, I mean, often, especially when there's kids, it's still family. It's, how are we, like more and more I'm seeing, how are we helping our kids well they can actually use our help as opposed to waiting until they get an inheritance when we're no longer here.
Yeah.
So kind of that living gifting. So that's something we see pretty regularly. Travel is always a big thing. It's a little bit stereotypical, but it is like, that is still a big focus for a lot of clients. But some, it's like tougher decisions. It's, we have these things we kind of want to be a priority in retirement, but a bigger priority is actually, being financially independent. And so we're trying to decide, like, do we really want to work a few more years, or do we just want to have that freedom today? Yeah. And maybe we give up one of those, like the travel, for example, or we're not going to travel as much just so we can get the freedom today. Right. So it kind of varies depending on the scenario, whether there's, how much financial flexibility there is there will often dictate kind of how some of those decisions are made as well.
I think that's a really perpetually fascinating question, especially as you start to get older, right? Because you're trying to weigh out, well, do I keep working and I'm giving up time I could be spending doing other stuff because I want a little bit more money and maybe that serves me better in the long run? Or do I stop working a little bit sooner? It gives me a little bit less money, maybe a little bit less flexibility, but then I know I've got more time to do stuff. And there's no one right answer. So that's interesting you bring that up, because that's like I said, a perpetually sort of fascinating question for me that I think everyone's got to wrestle with at one point or another. So
yeah. And you mentioned earlier about, having these conversations with people approaching retirement, but that is ideally they've already done this reflection and they've been doing it throughout their lifetime, right? And that's why, like, if you can start with your kids that's great. And kind of building the habit of them having this reflection and sitting back and thinking about these things, because then they probably aren't going to be feeling this big crunch when they get closer to the typical retirement time, right? Because if they've decided that's the most important thing, they've probably made it more of a priority to be saving and preparing for that ahead of time.
Yeah. No, good point. So let's talk about kids a little bit then. Let's talk about your kids. So I'm assuming, right, you're a financial planner, that you're teaching them nuts and bolts sort of things as they're growing up. How are you wrapping this prioritization piece into the financial practical things that you're teaching them? How do you marry those two things together in your whatever you're teaching them?
Yeah, so right now, I mean, they have at this point their piggy banks full of money, and so if they want. And so something that I'll add in ahead of time that is very almost defeating in this process a little bit is the grandparents always spoil them. So it kind of ruins a lot of what we try to do. But anyway, like my wife and I, we don't buy toys for our kids at all. So they're going to get lots of toys from grandma and grandpa, nana and papa anyway. But if they want something, they're asking us for it. Then that's like, we were just at the mall on the weekend, actually, my wife and I with the kids. And so they had some money. They went and decided how much they wanted to take out of their piggy bank to bring. And then they were like, trying to weigh off different ideas. So my oldest son actually, I thought, made a pretty good choice, where my youngest son just bought some Lego, which is pretty typical. Yeah. But anyway, my oldest son was like, well, I don't, and this is part of the conversation we're having with them, right? Like, do you really need toys? And think about the toys you have. Do you play with them for long versus what are some of the things you need? And anyway, he's playing rep baseball now, and a lot of the kids on his team have like sunglasses, which would be helpful for him to have. He's never really wore sunglasses. So anyway, so he made the decision that he thought that's something he doesn't have that would be useful for him, that he could use, partly because he wants it, the other kids have it, but partly because he's going to be playing baseball all summer and it's probably going to be sunny. So anyway, I thought that was a good decision for him to forego buying the toy for something that was more of a practical nature, but also trying to get him to, again, weigh like, well, I have all these things. Is another toy really going to add any value? Yeah. So they're also just getting to the age. And so my oldest, he has ADHD and he's pretty impulsive. So I would say him and my youngest, though, are kind of on the same wavelength, probably around making decisions like this, or just kind of from an emotional intelligence standpoint. So I feel like now with my youngest being 6 is where we're just starting to talk about like, how do we take this to the next level? And so, part of what we're looking at is like the FI Kids framework as an example. Some lessons I got, one lesson from one of my clients is their kids, they go to the market every Saturday. Their kids each get $10. So they can spend it however they want. If they want to buy a $9 smoothie or however they want to do it, but like that's all they get. And so they're around the same age and they've been doing this for a couple of years now. And so now they'll go around to all the vendors, ask prices, and then they'll come back and they give them the example of the kids working together, like, well, the smoothie's pretty big, so maybe we could get the smoothie and split that, and then we could get like the big donut or whatever, and we could split that, and we'll still have some money left over for next week for a bigger purchase. So they've just like learned to get creative and how they make that money go further, and sometimes they'll hold on to it so that if there's something they want to buy like a week later. So anyway, just starting to experiment with some different ideas like that as well.
Today's episode is sponsored by Venture Valley, a Singleton Foundation program. Venture Valley is a free esports-style video game. It's multiplayer. It's based around business creation, so it's fun to play and compete, and you learn business and financial basics while you play. You can find Venture Valley at venturevalleygame.com. And thanks to Venture Valley and the Singleton Foundation for sponsoring this episode. Yeah, no, that's actually really cool, because what I see there is you've got practical things that you're doing, right? They've got a piggy bank, or these clients that you have, like you get X amount of money and you go and you've got to spend your own money, but then that forces them right away to now have to make choices, right? And then that opens up this idea of the conversation and gets them thinking about things without them. So you're teaching them something. You're teaching them two things, I think, at least two. You're teaching them to assess and start to money only goes so far, and I've got to decide what matters to me and how I'm going to spend it, without them actually realizing that's what you're doing. But you're also teaching them to talk to you about money, right? And to have these conversations, which I think is going to pay huge dividends as they get older and their lives become more and more complicated. And they've got more and more things to discuss about money and more things they have to make choices about. And having somebody, having parents that they trust, that they are comfortable talking about money with, I think is super valuable. So that's really cool. And it's cool how it just all fits together kind of naturally, it seems like.
Yeah, I think that's a good point also about just being open to talking about money and creating that as like a normal thing early on. We have a lot of clients who, especially older clients, in their 70s, who, I'm just thinking of a few in particular, who have a really hard time talking to their kids about money, or like asking them if they need help, or letting them know what's going to happen when they pass away, even though it's, a pretty even split. Like there's nothing out of the norm, but they just have a really hard time having those conversations, which I don't think anything really good comes from that at any stage. And there's just a lot less chance for any kind of family rifts. Also, I'm talking about more estate planning now, but by just being open around money and talking about money openly, I think like it's actually a good thing.
Oh yeah, I think it's a very good thing. I think you're right. I don't think anything good comes from not talking about money, and I don't think anything good comes from not. And I understand that it's uncomfortable for most people, but there are also, especially as you get older, there's nothing good that comes from not being able to have some open conversations about you're getting older, and at some point you're going to, you're going to die, right? Like none of us get out of this alive, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So at some point that's going to happen. And so being able to talk about that when it's still hopefully a ways off gives you a little bit of space, but then also lets you plan. So I think talking about both those things, I think are super important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about, so I know you work with your clients a lot on creating, and you mentioned this before, right? So people want to have, once they get to retirement. So let's say we're talking traditional retirement age, they want to have income in retirement, right? And then they want to know that that's going to last. And even if someone gets to financial independence early, and especially if it's way early, if someone gets the financial independence when they're 35, if they really sort of do things right and they're highly motivated, then they still have to have ongoing income that's going to last them a really long time. So let's talk about how you approach that with your clients and some of the strategies there.
Sure. Yeah. So we start with we've gone through the values, we've understood the goals, and then we want to identify the retirement income style. So there's an assessment we use, retirement income style assessment, or the RISA. And basically that helps people and us get an idea of where they fit, their comfort level around how they're going to invest their money or where their money is going to be in order to create that paycheck for them. So for example, the more standard, or I guess what we would most typically see in a portfolio is like the total return portfolio. Like we build that regular portfolio of stocks and bonds, and there's a lot of good things that can come out of that. We're willing to play the odds, I guess you could say, or the probabilities of markets work. They always have, even though there's tough times. That's the downside, is we have to be willing to get through those difficult times. There's liquidity there, like we can take that money whenever we want it. We're not locked into anything. But there is that risk of the ups and downs, right? And even if things are going to work out over the long term, a lot of people are really worried about, well, what about in the short term when I'm taking money? And if you can't stick with a plan like that, or at least 100% into a plan like that, then it's probably not the best plan or portfolio for you, because you're probably going to blow it up at the worst time. So, that's just one potential income style. So the exact opposite of that would be the income protection income style, which means you're okay if you give up your flexibility with your money, and you're okay if you lock your money into something as long as you're going to get some kind of a guarantee. So that would be like taking a chunk of money and putting it into an annuity. So you're exchanging your money with the insurance company for a guaranteed income for life. Right. And so the good thing about that is that that income is going to be coming in month after month for as long as you're alive. The downside is that, if all your friends are doing great in the markets or whatever, and the cost of living is going way up, well, you're going to be maybe falling behind, right? So there's always trade-offs. But at the end of the day, what's most important is understanding what's the plan or the strategy that you're going to be able to stick with, so that you're going to have the best odds of success. And often it'll be a combination. So if your income style is that income protection piece, usually you're not putting all your money into an annuity. what we're trying to do is make sure that all your like necessities are taken care of by guaranteed income.
Sure, that makes
right?
sense. Yeah.
So for us, when we have CPP, Canada Pension Plan, Old Age Security, you guys have like Social Security. So we'll look at, well, what do we have in guaranteed income from like government benefits? Do you have a pension? Maybe there's a defined benefit pension that's going to provide some guaranteed income. And, maybe that's taking care of 80% of your necessities, all the things that you have to do just for your basic lifestyle. And then so maybe we're taking a chunk of your portfolio to cover off that other 20% with an annuity. And then you're taking the remainder for that total return type portfolio, because now you can live with those ups and downs knowing your bills are paid no matter what the market's doing.
Yeah.
Right. So that's an example of how we would potentially be switching up how we're going to allocate those funds to make sure that you have a plan you can stick with. Right. And then there's there's two other quadrants we would call it. So one would be your time segmentation. So this is really saying, okay, like I'm fine with the traditional portfolio, but I want to make sure we're segmenting off a certain number of years of income. So maybe we have some cash for the next year or two of spending. And then we have maybe so here we have GICs. You guys have, is it CDs, I think?
Oh yeah,
right. Like maybe there's
so
some kind of
put money in for a short period of time, and you earn like for 2 years or a year or whatever, and you get 5%. It is now some almost, but anyway, yeah,
exactly. So just guaranteeing a certain number of years of income is there in guaranteed type products, and then investing in that total return portfolio beyond that.
Okay.
And then there's like a risk wrap would be the other one, which is more like an insurance product that you can get your money back out of. Right. So there's some differences between Canada and the US on that, but there's some guarantees built into it, but there's still some liquidity. If you need it, you probably have to pay penalties or there's higher fees along the way. So again, there's a trade-off and you're deciding what's going to be the best comfort for you. But again, it comes back to what are your goals, and part of what your goals are is like, how much do you need to spend to meet your goals? And then, where are we creating that income from, which is going to go back to understanding your retirement income style to make sure we have the things in place we need so that you can stick with the plan through the good and the bad times.
Yeah. So, and if I'm understanding you right, Joe, so when you talk about the retirement income style, to some extent, that sounds like it fits a little bit with the idea of how risk averse you are or not, right? So am I right on that? So if you're kind of more comfortable with that, you might be more comfortable having more money just in stocks, right? And there's going to be ups and downs, but you're okay to weather that, versus someone else who's like, you know what? Nope, that freaks me out a little bit, and I want more guaranteed things because I don't want to have to stress about it. Is that right?
Exactly. You got it. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that makes sense, and that's cool that there are so many different ways to approach that, right? And you can do a combination of things. And I think that's where it can oftentimes be overwhelming for people. They know some of these things are out there, but they don't know the details. And then they think, it's kind of like sometimes with exercise or how you're eating, right? It's like, I know I need to do this thing, but then people avoid doing it because it's uncomfortable or it's unfamiliar. And again, I don't think anything good comes from that. So kind of diving in and starting to learn, because the things are, financial stuff doesn't have to be that complicated. It can be, right? And if you really want to optimize, you can get into all sorts of level of details. But if you can also just do the basics, and if you do those consistently and do them well, it doesn't have to, really, it's not beyond most people's grasp, not at all. And especially if they come to somebody like you and get help, and they've got someone who can explain it, right, in a pretty straightforward style, I think, that gives people a lot of sense of security and confidence and control. Like, oh no, this can work out okay. So,
yeah, I think the key too, if you're going to talk to somebody, is, what does that process look like? If they're asking you a lot of questions, like your advisor or planner is asking you a lot of questions and wanting to understand what your goals are, what you want your retirement to look like, what your retirement income style might be by having you do a questionnaire or figuring out your values, all that kind of stuff, like that's a good sign. But if you're on, meeting number one and someone's talking to you about annuities or stocks or what investment they're going to buy or what insurance you need, then that's a sign that you're just talking to a product salesperson as opposed to an advisor, right? So, yeah. And it's really hard to differentiate between an advisor who gives advice and an advisor who sells products, because they typically have the same job title. So
yeah, right.
Those are kind of I'd say the key thing to look for is if you're getting pitched any kind of a product in the first meeting, then you're probably talking to a product salesperson. Whereas if someone is trying to learn about you, understand what you're trying to achieve, putting together a plan, and then recommending products, that's probably going to be a better direction.
Yeah, well, because it sounds like, right, what they're doing is they're getting to know you first, and then they're recommending products based on what they've learned about you and what your priorities are, back to those, and then your retirement, what is it, the retirement income style, the reason.
Yeah, retirement income style. Yep.
Yeah, right. So how you feel about money, it sounds like, right? How you feel about risk and all those things together. And so understanding that about someone before you start recommending products, right, makes all the sense in the world, at least to me. So
sure.
Yeah. So that's actually really good, right? So somebody who's going out and maybe talking to someone or considering talking to someone for the first time, that's a good heads up for something to look for. If they're trying to pitch you things right away and you need to understand things and you want someone to understand you before they start making recommendations about products, that might be a good way for them to assess is this advisor a good fit for me or not, and do I need to maybe talk to a few other people and find someone where really I feel like it's a good fit and it's going to give me what I really want in the long run.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, because you want a relationship, right?
Exactly. You got it.
Yeah. Cool. So, and I know one of the things that you talk about too, and this is a little bit of what I referenced before. So I know you talk with your clients about a dynamic withdrawal strategy. And so it's a little bit more flexible than the 4% rule. So explain that for a few minutes.
Sure. Yeah. So at the end of the day, most people, and so this might be, I'm working with people approaching like a more traditional retirement age, right? So think late 50s into 60s. So this might not be fully applicable to someone who's trying to join the FIRE movement and is like 30 years old, because what the flexible withdrawal strategies, what they do is they allow you to spend more money early in retirement when you're more likely to be able to use that, right? You're still active. You still want to get out and do things. You have all these goals or dreams that you have while you're working. Like, when I retire, I'm going to do all these things, right? So most people want to spend more money early in retirement. So if you go with something like a traditional 4% rule, you're probably not going to run out of money in retirement, but what's probably going to happen is you're going to have like a big nest egg left over when you're 80 years old. And so that's not really what most people want to accomplish. So the flexible strategies, or dynamic, there's different names for it, dynamic withdrawal strategies, what they do is they allow you to start at a higher withdrawal rate. So say 5%. And if you think about 5%, well, that's only 1% higher than 4. Well, actually, it's 25% higher, right? So if we're thinking a $1 million portfolio, 4% rules 40% per year of a withdrawal, and 5% is $50,000. So it is actually a significant difference if we start adding that up over years, right?
Yeah.
And so basically what we're doing
more a year, right? So you're talking 40,000 versus 50,000, right? Which again, right? So the upside is you've got an extra 10 grand to spend now. Maybe that's what you do. You do your trips, or you do whatever sort of things that are important to you when you're 60 or 65, right? But it also means that money may not last as long, especially if you get more dips in the market. So if you live to 100, then maybe but then you're going to be doing less things in your 90s, for example, right?
Well, and that's typically what happens, right? And so where the dynamic piece of this, or the flexibility, is that you start with that higher amount, but you have our favorite withdrawal strategy is guardrails, so we start with this higher withdrawal amount, but if our portfolio drops to a certain level, so basically where we're taking out more than 6, so if we started at 5% and now we're taking out more than 6% of the portfolio, well, then we need to reduce what we're spending. So that's the guardrail piece, and that's where the flexible aspect comes in. So we need to be willing to take.
So that means, so just to clarify that, right? So that's if you've got a certain amount in your portfolio, right, and you're withdrawing 5%. If you get a dip in the market, and now that 50,000 that you're withdrawing now is 6% of your total versus 5%, then you've got to back it down to stay within that 5%. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah. So because year to year, it's not going to be exactly 5% no matter what. So we just have like a band, right? So that's what we call the guardrails.
Sure.
Just like if I'm taking my kids bowling, I put up the guardrails or whatever we want to call them. So when they throw it down, they're happy no matter what,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because it gets down to the end, whether because there's no gutter because they hit the guardrails.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
it's the same idea. So it's not a big adjustment. Typically, I mean, the way it is, if you look at the Journal of Financial Planning, is a 10% adjustment. So if you're taking $50,000 a year, you're adjusting that down to $45,000 a year, which you're still above the 4% rule in that scenario, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The flip side of that is there's an upper guardrail too. So, if you're lucky enough to retire and markets are good your first few years and you hit the upper guardrail, it's the opposite. So you actually just increase the amount you're taking by 10%, right? So this is really high level. Like there's some inflation adjustment rules in there as well. And it's just one strategy. So there's also the like a ratchet strategy, which is for someone who doesn't want to be flexible and taking less. So, or maybe they want to have a significant legacy to leave behind when something happens to them. So in that scenario, they would start out at that lower withdrawal amount. So maybe it's 4%. Again, just throwing out examples. So maybe it's more conservative. But if their portfolio goes up to a certain amount, so I think like typically the way the rule on this one is written is if you had $1 million and at any point, and you keep it up with inflation, but at any point your portfolio goes above $1.5 million, so 50% higher than where you started, then you bump up the amount you're taking. And then you live on that new amount. And if anytime after 3 years, you're still above 50% of where you started from. So again, if you started $1 million, you're still above $1.5 million, then you can bump up your withdrawals again. And so that's a way for someone who's like, yeah, if things are going really well, I want to spend more money, but I'm not willing to take a chance that I'm going to have a lower, I'm going to be able to spend less money later in retirement, or I'm not going to be able to leave that nest egg for my kids or whatever the scenario is.
Yeah, yeah. So what I like about all of that is a couple of things. A, it just fits with the idea that there's no one right or one best path for anybody. Everybody's got a little bit different. They got to figure out their own puzzle and their own puzzle for financial independence and in order to get there, and then how to live once they're there, right? And so it's always a little bit different. So I like that that's more flexible. The other thing that it kind of fits into with me, and this is what I referenced before, is I don't know if you've read Die with Zero by Bill Perkins.
It's been on my list for a while. I still haven't got to it yet.
Yeah. So it's cool, right? So just to summarize real quick, his point is that there are times in your life where really those are the optimal times to do things. Sometimes, right, you can't do certain things once you get to a certain age, right? But other times, like it's better if you can do them at certain points in your life. Like, so for example, I did a thing when I was in my mid-20s and I went to Vail, Colorado to live for the winter and be a ski bum, and the friends of friends who said I could stay with them kind of screwed me over. And I'm like, nah, all right, I'll live out of the back of my truck, right, in the middle of winter. Now, it was a great experience.
Dope.
I would never do that now, right? But I mean, I look back on that fondly. But again, that was something, and that's kind of a sort of out there example, but I think it applies with all sorts of things, right? So if you want to go and do some sort of adventure travel thing, or even you just want to go to Europe and you're just going to be walking all over the place, that's easier to do when you're 30 or 40 or 50 than it is when you're 80. Because even if you're healthy at 80, the endurance isn't the same and you just have other things to kind of think about and consider. And so as part of this whole idea of all the stuff we've been talking about, prioritizing and deciding what you want to do, there's also this piece of when do I want to do these things? And having this idea of a more dynamic withdrawal strategy, I think is really cool, because then it's another piece for you to think about, but it also gives you more flexibility for how to structure your life in a way that's going to bring you the maximum amount of fulfillment and joy. And I would actually say that in terms of the FIRE movement, that thinking about the withdrawal stuff actually still does matter, because this whole die with zero concept, right, and wanting to spend more money at certain ages does come into play. Even when you're younger, even if you reach financial independence and you're at 30 or 40, right, then I still think it's totally relevant. Anyway, so I think that's really cool, and it's cool that you have those discussions with your clients. I think that's great.
Yeah, well, I mean, it comes back to what we said earlier, right? It's just about understanding the client and what's most important to them, and then coming up with the strategy that's going to be the best fit.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's super cool, man. I really like that. So take a few minutes and just tell us about your podcast.
Sure. So Your Retirement Planning Simplified. We're at, I want to say like 140 episodes or something now. So we've been doing it for quite a while, and really it's just, I mean, the name was very intentional. Your Retirement Planning Simplified. We try to simplify concepts around retirement, and it's not all money related. Like today, I actually recorded a few different episodes. One was on dating and retirement, another on ageism. So, I mean, it is very much focused on the retirement planning journey, but also like the kind of those peripheral pieces too. So, yeah, the idea really is just to, I mean, one of our core values, so coming back to values for our business, is approachability, because I feel like our business is not necessarily the most approachable, right? A lot of people think like Wall Street, hard charging kind of people, or heavy sales or whatever it is, which is not what we are. And we want people to feel confident to get advice when they need it. And, I think that one of the best ways for people to have the confidence is for them to find education, so they at least have some confidence in their financial knowledge, and then they're more likely then to reach out to get help because they don't feel so embarrassed, right? So you wouldn't believe the amount of times where I've had people say, I know I should have come in earlier, I'm just too embarrassed about what I don't know, and which is really it's a sad to hear, but also people are scared to be taken advantage of, right? So that really is what it all comes down to, is just educating people so that they can make good financial decisions and they're not scared to get help when the time's right. We're actually just launching a new podcast. I'm not sure when it's going to come out, but July 1st, Business and Exit Planning Simplified. And it's really just because we work with a lot of business owners at that, like approaching retirement. So it's just kind of like an add-on to what we're already doing, where we're just going to help business owners making sure that they're getting their businesses ready to sell and actually be able to sell them, because most businesses don't actually sell when they go for sale. Yeah, and a lot of business owners are counting on their business liquidation to fund their retirement, but they don't. And I've seen this a lot of times, they don't actually get what they thought they were going to get, and it doesn't go to plan. Right. So trying to help people who are business owners think about that as well.
No, I think that's really great, because there's a unique set of things that they've got to think about and prepare for. So that's awesome. That's very cool.
Yeah, so I really have no information other than the name, because we haven't even launched it yet. And I'm sure what website I'm going to post that stuff on. But retirementplanningsimplified.ca is where you'd find like Your Retirement Plan Simplified blog and podcast and videos and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay, great. I'll put that in the show notes so people can go check that out. So last thing before we wrap up. So if listeners were going to take one action after listening to this episode, give us, 1 to 3 recommendations that they could choose from if they were going to say, all right, I'm going to do one thing in the next 2 weeks.
Sure. So I'd say, number one is, and this depends on how old your kids are, but when your kids are to the point where, if you've been talking to them about money and you really want them to get an idea of like some of the stuff I've been talking about, one of my favorite books to recommend is The Latte Factor. I'm not sure if you've read that one or not.
I haven't.
Yeah, so it's just a parable. So it's just a story about a travel journalist who spends money every day on a latte, and these little things that add up. And basically, she meets this guy at where she gets her lattes, and then he basically, through a number of lessons, teaches her on how she can have the things that she wants without having to give up, by focusing on what's her like most important priorities. So a lot of the things we talked about today. Yeah. So I find it, so anyone I hire that works for me, like that's the first thing they get on day one is I give them that book. I just think it's a great, just kind of just a nice story that really just shows the power of kind of getting clear on your priorities. So I would say, yeah, if you have, a teenager, they can definitely read that book. Or if you're listening to this, whoever you are, you can get that book. I would say that's probably number one. And then number two is just understand your values. Actually, on retirementplanningsimplified.ca, on there we have the Retirement Navigator, and it's some different modules. And one of the modules specifically is about how to, like that worksheet, to get your values, figure out your own core values. So I would say, just get clear on what is most important to you, and then you can use that to filter out your decisions around money.
Yeah. Yeah, super important stuff, because otherwise you can't. It's next to impossible to make progress if you don't know where you're spending your money, and then start making decisions about, well, what do I value and where do I want to spend it because it means something to me, and where can I cut back or not spend it because that doesn't really mean that much, right? So exactly. Kind of like your son bought sunglasses instead of something else, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was actually pretty proud of him about that. But
Yeah,
also
yeah.
to your point about the talking about money and trying to like put these lessons on, he kept going back to me like, hey, Dad, you would get the sunglasses, right? Like that's a better choice than a toy, right? So at least he's listening anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and then he wanted I don't know, not your approval, I guess, but also he just wanted to know, hey, is this making sense, right? So that's super cool. Very cool.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. It was good.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joe, for coming on. I think it was a great conversation and lots of good information. And so, I would encourage everyone to go check out Your Retirement Planning Simplified. You can find that on all the podcast places. So,
Yep.
and
Sure.
also the website. I'll put that in the show notes. So thanks a lot, Joe.
All right. Thanks, Dominic. Happy to be here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the FI for Kids podcast. Please support the show by hitting subscribe and receive new episodes every Thursday. The intro and exit music this episode are courtesy of Douglas Cameron. As always, you can find links to the FI for Kids music in the show notes. Thanks again, and we'll talk next week.
You're like the horizon. I can't reach you, you're so far away. And if I run to the place I want you to stay, you'd be gone. I've been left wondering why you moved on, and why you never said goodbye. I can't wait any longer. I see the writing on the wall. It's time for us to say, tomorrow we are yesterday. Tomorrow we are yesterday. You're like the sun.